Let me go ahead and introduce myself, and I will hand in to Austin to introduce himself, and obviously our experts, Dr. Sanjay Manchanda and Penijean Gracefire, which I'm very excited to have them on board as well. So my name is Nazanin Hossein-Kha. I am the Director of Special Projects at Vielight. I will be owning this Neuro Pro device alongside with Austin. This is something very exciting for all of us. We have been working so hard on making this device with its exciting features. I will let Austin introduce himself. I will quickly jump on some of the features that the device has, and I will let our experts to take it away. Austin, go ahead.
Great, thank you. So my name is Austin. I'm the Marketing and Conferences Manager here at Vielight. And so I'll be working with Nazanin for the support and the guidance of the Neuro Pro. So if you have questions or emails to be sent, you can send it directly to us or the pro.support email, and we'll be the ones in charge of that. So yeah, I'm very excited to have this webinar here with Sanjay and Penijean, some of the experts and brains behind the protocols in the Neuro Pro. So yeah, I guess I'll hand it to Sanjay. You can introduce yourself and kind of just talk to everybody here.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here with all of you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, great. Yeah, so just a few words. I am used to be, long time back, a computer science professor and an electrical engineer. And then I switched to being a meditation teacher and a psychotherapist, have been doing that for 30 years. And then 20 years ago or more, I started doing neurofeedback and with people as well, clinically, as well as working with low-level energy stimulation of the brain with current, light, sound, and then recently also did research in ultrasound for meditation purposes. So I've been working with the Vielight for more than 15 years, and working within my practice, find it amazing. And I'm a consultant for Vielight, and also been doing a recent study on meditation and the the Neuro Pro. So happy to be here.
It's so great to have you here, Sanjay. Thank you so much. Penijean, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Humorously enough, Sanjay and I are an excellent complement because I actually started out in the mental health field and then moved over into neurotechnology. Well, I say moved. As Sanjay would probably agree, we're simply accumulating and integrating different areas as we go. And so my particular background in mental health is part of what drove me towards there's got to be more we can do besides just talk at people about things. And so moving over into frequency science, essentially, we joke a little bit in the industry, we're the type of people who put the freak in frequency. I am definitely one of those, because the idea of being able to integrate together light frequency, sound frequency, doing the EEG frequency work that we do in neurofeedback. So Vielight is one of those tools that allows for a lot of individual choices and creativity. And that was part of what really drew me to this team. And so a lot of what we're going to be doing today, I think, is going to be essentially a demonstration of the creativity and flexibility of the Vielight platform. And I'm really excited to show you some of the stuff I've been doing with it later.
That's amazing. Thank you, Penijean. Let me share my screen just 1 second so I can give you some overview about what this Neuro Pro device is, and some of the new features, because some of you may have seen the Neuro Pro 1 device, the previous version of the device, but there's a lot of more embedded aspects in this state-of-the-art new Neuro Pro 2 device that we can talk about. I will go through them briefly, and then I will open the floor for Penijean and Sanjay to talk more about some of the exciting features, some of the exciting protocols that is already embedded there. Let me get my device here. So here I have I do have my own device at home, and I was actually doing the meditation protocol in the morning from the one that Sanjay has embedded. So this device has a lot of features. You can actually see that with this version of the device, the aesthetic appearance is better. It is more comfortable, better contact. So each LED is in touch with the scalp just directly, more powerful LEDs and more LEDs. So we do have 10 LEDs over the head and 2 LEDs in the nose for this device. Each LED, though, is specifically on a very particular location, and then there's reasons for that. There has been enough research showing why default mode network is important, why salience network, why central executive network, all of those networks on the brain are working together, and each of them are very, very important. And so the reason behind each of the LEDs over the head is to cover some of those networks together. This device is connected through a phone that is provided with the device to the app, to the Vielight app, which is the graphical user interface. On the app, you would be able to customize everything pretty much. It's highly customizable. So on each LED, you can actually set what LED you want to choose and to operate. Maybe set all of the LEDs or just one of them, let's say the frontal lobe or whatever that you would like to make modifications. You can also change the frequency, set the frequencies between 1 Hertz, maybe all the way to 9,999 Hertz. You can also change the power. There's frequency sweep. You can sweep the frequency up or down. You can sweep the power up and down. And there's this new feature in the Neuro Pro 2 device that is, we have cross-frequency coupling on one location. So assuming that there is one LED on let's say on the, I would give an example as the frontal LED, and then you can have 2 frequencies pulsating at the same time on that LED. So on one specific location, you can have 2 frequencies operating at the same time. So these are some of the high-level functions about the device that I wanted to talk about. Each LED is specialized. We have our own designers and engineers in-house that would come up with the power, and the power is actually very much sufficient for the brain penetration. And here, as I was just showing, there's this app, and you can make modifications to it. Just wait for 1 second. There. And lastly, this is the overall feature. So the 2 intranasals that we have with this device that we didn't have with the Neuro Pro 1 enables us to target, let's say, do cross-functional or cross-locational aspects of the brain. And for some of the experts in the field, let's say using the right nostril and maybe the left side of the brain simultaneously would enhance the synchronicity of the brain. As I said, there's a cross-frequency coupling features in this device for enhanced synchronization of the LEDs. And lastly is the embedded protocols. So we do have several protocols from our own end. So we have the alpha protocol embedded, which all the LEDs are pulsating at 10 Hertz altogether. We do have the gamma protocol, which all of the LEDs are pulsating at 40 Hertz. We have one protocol which is called alpha gamma. So it has 10 minutes of the alpha, 5 minutes of break, and 10 minutes of the gamma protocol. So in that duration of 25-minute period, you would get both the alpha and the gamma protocols. And very, very, very exciting stuff. protocols from Sanjay and protocols from Penijean. To tell you more about this device, I can actually go through more of the features later on, but I'm very excited that I have Sanjay and Penijean here, so I don't want to keep you waiting. I would like Penijean to start and present.
Do I have shareability? All right. Let me grab some visuals that'll help me talk about what we're doing. So some of you have already had devices land, I think, and some of you have them on the way. Is that correct? Okay. So I am assuming that some of you have already seen the material that we have put out before, and you'll probably be a little bit familiar with what I'm showing you, but part of why I want to make sure I've got good visuals is because I am going to tell you some fun things that are also some mildly complex ideas. And I want to make sure you guys have enough time, even after I show you stuff, to ask questions. So I'm going to give you a little overview and then pass it off to Sanjay. And then we're going to have a nice section at the end for Q&A. Okay, however, I will also try to keep an eye on the chat, or actually maybe have Naz and Austin keep an eye on the chat, so that if something comes up that you immediately don't understand, please feel free to drop in the chat and I'll try to clarify as I go. And then anything complex we'll keep for Q&A. Okay, as my background is in a wider array of different types of neurotechnology, I'm also very focused on thinking about how to integrate different principles into using photobiomodulation, right? So as you guys know, the actual LEDs, and Naz and Austin, feel free to jump in if I say anything that's inaccurate. The actual LEDs in the Neuro Pro headset all have a wavelength of 810 nanometers. So when we think about photobiomodulation technology, one of the things that we kind of lean into, and you see a lot in the literature, are the different wavelengths of light in the different LED products. So, you know, you've got some hanging out in the 1060, 1070 range. You've got some 810, you've got some 633, some 655. You'll see that even in the Vielight product lineup, that there are different wavelengths of light. We associate those wavelengths with different effects potentially. And it's the same way that we essentially think about EEG, right? Different wavelengths of EEG we essentially associate with potentially different functionalities. So faster frequencies and slower frequencies we pair up with possible effects or impacts when we introduce them to the brain. And so coming from an EEG background and thinking about what are the different frequency ranges that we understand and use in EEG, part of the design philosophy that I'm trying to bring to the table is this idea that essentially we are looking at local areas of the brain and we are looking at network capacity, right? So at the local area, we've got what we can do with the frequency ranges, right? And then we've got potentially taking those local areas, networking them together and creating more complex effects. Like Naz was saying earlier, the idea of having the default state network, right? We have a lot of networks we've already identified and named and associated with some functionality. So when I'm thinking about how to lean into the real, I would say maybe the innovative features that are emerging out of the Vielight products, and especially the Neuro Pro 2, what I'm really thinking about is how important it is to consider really the layout that we have to work with. Okay, so as I say that, this is a deeply rudimentary overview of taking the positions of the LEDs in the Neuro Pro 2 and gently assigning them to some regional neurophysiological associations, right? So what I've done here is borrow a little bit from infographic design, and you guys will see that there are some colors that are the outline colors, and there are some colors that are filled in. And what that's meant to do is to help overlap a bit between the way that I have essentially just selected out the LEDs we have available and grouped them together. So for example, you'll see this blue midline. These are the 3 LEDs that go down the middle. But you'll also see that the 3 LEDs that go down the middle we're calling midline are also part of the frontal area, this central region, and also the parietal region, right? So this is how the display works, and it's mainly to help you guys just think through as we're associating out with how would we like to pick things. What are those areas of the brain potentially associated with functionally? So we're thinking functional and local, but we're also thinking as we put them together, what can we affect at the network level? So these were the ideas behind how I ended up then choosing what essentially locations went through when I did protocol designs. Okay, the other thing that I want to tell you guys about, forgive me for jumping around, I'm like this a little bit. The other thing I want to tell you about this is the idea of doing a protocol cascade. So the concept is that when we pick out things to introduce to the brain, potentially if you do a lot of the same thing over a long period of time, it loses a little bit of the novelty impact that recruits the brain's attention to pay the brain's attention it has to pay. It recruits the brain's attention, and the economy of attention begins to reduce because it's just not as novel. The other thing that are the elements of how we think about designing things that continue to recruit the brain's attention is it sufficiently interesting for the brain to continue to pay attention? So is it new and is it interesting? Now, I say it this way because brains are people, and people are sometimes easily bored if it's not sufficiently novel and there's not enough detail to it, right? So with that in mind, I was like, okay, what could we potentially do with all these Vielight features to create things that could both recruit the brain's attention with a little change and novelty throughout the protocol, and also give it some complexity? Because your brain, if you think about how it works, it has all those local areas that are kind of engaging and disengaging, and the overall network capability is recruiting local brain areas that do different stuff together into networks to do more complex tasks. So we are looking at a protocol that has several different stages to continue to introduce novelty. Like, we're asking it to do different stuff. So you're not getting like, I don't remember how many this is. Let me do the math. 2, 4, 3, 10. What is this? 23 minutes. You're getting essentially 23 minutes. If I did the math wrong, it's okay. You can put it in the chat. You're getting essentially 23 minutes of attention recruitment from the brain and a conversation with the brain that we're hoping will mimic the natural cascade of behaviors that the brain does itself when it, say, generates alpha. Like, you will notice in this protocol, and I'll take just a minute to explain what you're looking at. It's pretty intuitive, but just in case. So this is the map of the LEDs that you have available to work with. The in left and the in R is nasal left and nasal right. So we're looking down from the top. And when we were thinking about what is it we want a brain to do when it relaxes and recovers, a lot of the literature behind how does a brain shift from a very engaged state to a relaxed state centers around alpha behaviors, right? And there are generators of alpha in your brain. There are subcortical generators, like generators down at the bottom, and there are generators across the parietal cortex. There's a handful of places where your brain tends to just hang out in alpha, right? And so we think about, okay, what does it naturally trend towards doing? And so this protocol says, hey, let's just do an overall alpha, all the LEDs. Let's just introduce a couple minutes of just alpha. Now, when I say alpha, what do I mean? There are 2 ways to think about this. One is the actual frequency range that we potentially associate. So you guys will see I have arbitrarily created 1 or 2 of my own little ranges. So I've got a thalpha in here. That's a 6 to 9. A lot of classical alpha range is in 8 to 12 hertz. And when I say 8 to 12 hertz, what I mean because this isn't NIR, this is pulsed NIR, pulsed near infrared. So when I talked earlier about all the LEDs having an 810 nanometer wavelength, so there's a difference between steady state LED, where you turn it on and it basically just gives you whatever that nanometer wavelength is, right? So if we were to do a steady state with one of the LEDs from the Neuro Pro 2, you would be getting an 810 wavelength. And we would associate some therapeutic benefits specifically with that 810 wavelength. When we begin to pulsed NIR, we still get the 810 wavelength, but we turn it off and on a number of times a second. So if we were to pulse it in, say, the delta range, that light would essentially come off and on 1 to 4 times a second, at most 4 times. That's a pretty slow blink of the light, right? If we were to pulse it maybe up in a gamma range, it would come on, let's say 55 times a second. Now, when you're physically watching an LED, you can't always see the light. I'll tell you guys a little trick. If you want to actually see and enhance that light flicker when you're looking physically at your device, if you want to see it work, take your cell phone, turn on camera, and put camera over the LED. Watch it in the screen. That will actually enhance the light changing in behavior that you can't always as easily see with your naked eye. Okay, side tip. So when we're thinking about, oh, the light is blinking, there is information contained in the 810 nanometer itself that gives your brain and body cues towards what we would like it to pay attention to and maybe the effects we would like it to have. When you begin to pulse that 810 nanometer, now you've got all the information that's in the 810, but you have the additional information of the frequency that you're pulsing that same 810 light. So now you've got double information, right? And so how fast or how slow, and these numbers are, the hertz is how many times a second the light turns off and on, right? In EEG world, hertz means how many times a second does an EEG signal essentially go up and down in a cycle. So it's always just about timing. We're tracking how fast or how slow the light is pulsing, and the wavelength is how short or how long that wavelength is, which is essentially still a function of time. So what we're doing is we're saying we can give the brain information, right, based on essentially what we ask the LED itself to do. So if you've got these 810 LEDs and we're pulsing them, and I'm saying, ooh, we're going to do some alpha with the Neuro Pro 2, what I literally mean is we're going to take all these LEDs and we're going to essentially pulse them somewhere in the 8 to 12 range. And this little intro to the protocol is all the LEDs at the same time pulsing at an alpha frequency, turning off and on somewhere between about 8 and 12 hertz. Now, part of the design elements that I think are relevant when you guys are looking at the options and choosing from them, or trying to make your own options, is thinking about, if I have all the LEDs do the same thing at the same time, I'm going to have a very synchronous, widespread, global attention effect. It's basically asking the whole brain to kind of hang out in the same frequency range. But when you ask the brain to basically be on the same wavelength, it makes communication between the areas easier. When we talk about people being on the same wavelength, we mean that it's easy to communicate back and forth, right? So when you sync up the different LEDs, then you get synchronous behavior, which makes communication much easier. So this little intro says, everybody hang out in alpha. This is about to be an alpha protocol. Welcome to the program. So we do a little intro, couple minutes of just all the LEDs get alpha, right? The second stage of the protocol, you will see that we have only activated the 2 intranasal and the one back hanging out almost at the cerebellum placement, right? So back of the brain, the lowest location we have, and the intranasal. Now, the reason that I'm calling this, again, very rudimentary limbic is the idea of we've got areas at the bottom of our brain that are less easy to recruit with external peripheral information, right? So how do we essentially, like, you know, in EEG world, right? What we do is we put sensors on the outside of the scalp, and we essentially monitor those neuronal activation patterns. And then we say, hey, what's it doing? Can I give feedback based on that? Vielight is a feed forward, right? It's essentially, it introduces information and it just goes. It's not modulating based on what your brain's doing in response, right? So in neurofeedback land, there's a conversation happening. And currently with the Neuro Pro, there is essentially almost like, it's like a TED Talk, right? It's an educational experience where you are not having a conversation, you are having information and education being introduced to your brain, right? So when you do a protocol, however you decide to introduce that information becomes essentially how good of a TED Talk, how much education is occurring. So when we move from whole brain to just the ones that potentially recruit from that intranasal, maybe bottom of the frontal cortex there, we're looking at almost like that lower anterior cingulate, dorsal, like what do we have really kind of at the bottom of the front of the brain? And then what do we have at the bottom of the back of the brain? Yeah. So we're trying to get those subcortical, those lower, maybe almost thalamic level generators of alpha. And you'll notice it's a alpha, a very slow alpha from the bottom of the brain. Because how does the brain naturally produce and create alpha? How does it propagate across your brain? So we say, hey, everybody, this is about to be an alpha situation. And then we start to generate or stimulate what we think are the alpha producers naturally in the brain. And then we say, cool, all right, we've stimulated maybe some alpha behavior at the bottom of the brain. Let's now, again, pull everybody back into the program, alert the brain, we are going full alpha here, and then we give it something a little complex. These have mostly been simple. Everybody, bottom of the brain, everybody. All right, now let's do a little more independence. So the fun thing about a chiastic stage in one of these protocols is that it's going to actually take the front left nasal, and it's going to sync up its behavior with the right side of the brain. The right nasal is going to sync up behavior with the left side of the brain. So now we've got a couple things happening here. We've got a phase A and a phase B design. Two independent things happening. When phase A is on, phase B isn't. And when phase B is on, phase A isn't. So we're getting a really excellent kind of hemispheric independence to what we're asking the brain to do at a time. But we are tying that right hemispheric recruitment ask with left intranasal. Now, why would I do something like this? It's because thinking about those lower level networks, right? So that potential anterior cingulate that really gates and it communicates between subcortical areas of your brain, like amygdala and basal ganglia, and then the frontal cortex, the upper cortical region of your brain that does a lot of executive function decision making. How do we really create, you know, good conversation between anterior cingulate, insula, frontal cortex? So we are pulling the LEDs that we think are closest and approximate to those network regions and saying, hey, left anterior cingulate, left frontal nasal essentially, why don't you connect up with the right side of the brain, right side connect up with the left. So we're looking for those network effects, and now we're asking for something more complex. So now we've given the brain a lot of information, and we go back to just that lower brain recruitment again, and we hang out at the very end in some alpha range. Now, you guys, this is a whole little journey. I probably won't talk about all the protocols at this level of detail unless you've got specific questions. I'll show you the other ones. But the reason I went in that level of detail is because when you decide to pick one of these and try it out, there's a few things to keep in mind, right? One is that they'll run for a little while, but you'll be able to visually see the stages, like it'll go through the stages. So when you guys are trying them out, potentially on yourself or maybe on someone else, some people are going to have fairly noticeable sensations and experiences as they try out different protocols. they'll have some people have sort of almost a physical sensation effect, even when they are just running any of the intro little, like, even if you just pick like sort of a simple, let's try a little alpha, just that for a few minutes, right? Sometimes people will be quite sensitive and responsive, and other times they won't notice anything particularly sensory as an experience. And so you'll have people with a variety of responses. Some people will notice it later. Some people, it'll take maybe a handful of sessions before they really start to notice changes. And the reason I'm saying about this spread of responsivity is that if you've got this on somebody who maybe has a fairly compromised brain, possible history of illness, maybe some brain injury, because what we're doing is we're asking for attention, and we're asking for maybe sometimes a little bit of a complex attention. People who have less resources to give us to pay attention, or potentially have less capacity to do complex recruitment tasking, they may become fatigued, a little headachy, maybe even like mildly dizzy. People may actually have like physical sensations when we ask their brains to do something that exceeds the threshold of capacity. So if you're working with people that potentially have a history of significant brain injury or illness, or maybe some some physical vulnerability or limitations, and you were like, hey, let me try some of these, it looks like it could be good for you, and they start to flag or feel a little overwhelmed, you are absolutely welcome to simply stop or pause the protocol. There is nothing in the design that requires for you to complete it. As I've been testing these out with people, some people have said, I really love the first couple stages of this protocol, but if I do the whole thing, I feel like it's a little too much. And I'm like, excellent. Just cherry pick out of it what works for you, because part of the point of the design is to give someone like a whole arc, like a whole narrative experience for the brain to learn something from, and to help model the brain shifting back and forth between different things we'd like for it to be able to do. However, there aren't any rules that you have to do the whole thing. So you guys are very welcome to try stuff out, see what's happening in the different stages, stop it when you want. It's designed to be useful and independent components, and for the whole thing together to work as a cohesive design. Okay, so I've got 4 more protocols you guys will have. I'm going to do a quick little overview of, and then I'm going to pause and essentially give the floor to Sanjay. But maybe before I do that, I'll take a quick peek at the chat. Let me give you, Austin, is there anything happening that I need to check in that we can't save to Q&A? Are we okay so far?
Nothing too urgent. Yeah, with just a bunch of questions coming in there. Yeah, Naz, I don't know if there's any you want to point out, but I think the rest can wait till Q&A.
We will absolutely answer those. Okay, so the 5 protocols that you guys have from me are going to be relax and recover, emotional balance, focus, flex, and nod to the kids, and enhance. And the point of these, you'll notice, so I'm going to talk about each of them just a little bit. You'll notice emotional balance is a theta to beta. You will see that focus is pretty much mostly beta action. Flex is alpha gamma. And then enhance is theta gamma with a little bit of an alpha stabilizer at the end. Now, the reason that they are designed this way is to kind of span the potential options of that pulsing frequency range, right? So for example, with emotional balance, there's been some really kind of lovely, I would say some lovely research and exploration and clinical work that's coming out of a few communities in the neurotech industry. There's some deep brain reorienting science and philosophy, and there's some very lovely classical, over the last 50 years, idea of kind of trying to train or help people learn how to be comfortable hanging out in the slower frequencies of the brain that are so foundational to our capacity to connect with our bodies and feel comfortable and safe in our bodies, right? So a lot of alpha theta training, or the idea of being able to really sort of work in those slower brain frequencies that we find most dominant, maybe in the brainstem and subcortical regions of the brain, those are very critical for memory, body connection, a lot of emotional regulation. So being able to have a connection between the lower brain and then the cortical brain, the higher brain, where we do a lot of the thinking and processing, this is, I think, a core thrust for many therapeutic approaches, right? Like a nice brain-body balance and communication. So the idea behind emotional balance is like, can we essentially encourage the brain to connect with those slower ranges where it does feel more grounded, right? And sort of almost internally oriented. The thing though is when you do a lot of maybe slow wave, slow state induction, not everybody is as easily able to then sort of re-engage back up into the more externally oriented states, right? So this protocol is meant to create like a nice grounding experience, but then at the end to have like a gentle reconnection back to the mid-range beta frequencies that are essentially what you use when you are orienting to and alert to the external environment around you. So sort of a theta range is more about what's happening inside you. A mid-beta range is immediate environmental observation, right? This doesn't go all the way up into fast betas and gammas, where it's very much external orientation. This is a, can we ground you in your body and then not leave you in that deep state? Can we then gently pull you back to like just an immediate surrounding awareness? So the idea behind this is, when you're really stressed out and overwhelmed, can we give you something kind of gentle and stabilizing, but not leave you too deep in the state? And I think that this one can be quite useful as a standalone, but also as potentially an adjunctive to other therapies. Okay. Focus is definitely hey guys, let's take you through a little beta adventure, because the faster frequency beta ranges, and for people who don't have the background in this, when we're thinking slower pulsing to faster pulsing, the idea is that there are slower internal states and faster external states that allow for us to essentially shift states or tasking behaviors. We need to be able to pay attention to what's happening inside of us. We need to be able to relax and sleep and repair and heal. And we also need to be able to pay attention to what's happening outside of us, what's going on in the world, how do I process what's coming in and then reply to it. So faster frequencies like betas and gammas is where we hang out to do that sort of externally oriented processing. Slower frequencies is where we do a lot of sort of memory storage and consolidation, like the more internally oriented physiological tasking, right? And then alpha is the range where we essentially are right in the middle. We could slow down into more internal. We could speed up into more externally focused. It's a lovely bridge that helps us with that state flexibility, right? So when you're thinking, oh, I really want to be zoned in and productive, betas are usually the range that we hang out in to do maybe focused productive tasks. So the thing is, the faster you go, the more externally oriented the tasking. So we're thinking low beta, mid beta, high beta, right? We're going like more and more focus. So when I designed this one, I was like, all right, listen, let's absolutely go mid beta, high beta, but you'll notice at the end, there's a couple of minutes of low beta. Now remember, I said, the faster the frequency, the more sort of externally oriented the tasking, and the more maybe focus you might find yourself. Here's the thing, right? If I just ran you up into high beta and left you there, you might be quite focused, but you might have trouble with that state flexibility, right? So if you need to maybe multitask, or you need to maybe answer a question from somebody, I don't want to leave you in a hyper-focused state where it's harder for you to mediate maybe interruption or complexity. So at the very end, you've got just a little low beta to make sure that you don't go completely off the high beta cliff. You guys will probably see as we're going through here, I'm trying to think about what it is that we want the brain to learn and experience and potentially be able to do, right? This one, so there's a lot of history with Vielight and alpha and gamma. Alpha and gamma have essentially been adorable. I'm just touching things on my trackpad, my apologies. Alpha and gamma have been, like the 10 hertz and the 40 hertz have really been kind of a strong historical research approach, because, you know, what's lovely about 10 hertz is it gets you right in the middle of that alpha range for that state flexibility. What's lovely about 40 hertz, it has you up in gamma for that steady state persistence. So alpha is kind of about, can we help your brain be more flexible? And gamma is about, can we help you be more, almost like a little bit like peak performance? Can we help you be more focused and engaged? And so between those two, you represent a lot of the behaviors that people have trouble with, flexibility or essentially focus, the behaviors people have trouble with that turn into the ways that they find their performance or functionality affected. So this is essentially a slightly more complex version, because what I'm doing here is being like, okay, let's make some slightly more kind of complex alpha behavior. But this gamma sweep, the idea of a sweep is we actually go through multiple frequencies. So this isn't just 40 hertz. This is actually, was this 11 minutes? This is actually 11 different gamma frequencies that are all around that 40 hertz range. So we're like, hey, let's take advantage of that whole gamma range that we could hang out in. So this is just a slightly more complex version of taking alpha and gamma, because also the other thing we experience is not everybody has a great response from jumping straight from 10 hertz to 40, right? So if you do at 10 hertz and you do at 40 hertz, some people will have lovely effects, and other people will be like, that's a pretty abrupt jump, right? Between like a sort of an alpha state and then like a focused gamma state. So this also helps to gently introduce or sort of ramp you up from an alpha to a gamma. Okay, and then that very last one, enhance. This one I kind of love, because all of the protocols that I've made for you, they are meant to represent somewhat the frequency ranges that you could play in and engage in and design with, but they're also meant to help demonstrate a little bit the different features that are available to choose. And this one really highlights the cross frequency features, right? And so the point of this one, remember I said earlier with emotional balance, I was like, hey, that theta state is one where you can kind of feel very connected to your body, internally focused, kind of grounded. I left this one to last because I think it'll be a lovely segue for what Sanjay is going to talk about with the meditation approach. So this was my nod towards a couple of things. One is the connections between the body and the brain that underpin motor movement and balance. This one's really it's a dual wielded protocol. So it's the idea of what are the areas of the brain that are really in charge of motor movement and balance, because we know some of them are at the bottom of the brain and some of them are at the top. How do we get those connected up in a way that allows for better communication to take place? And so I'm essentially pairing up the idea of connecting that internal state and that external orientation state at the same time. Can I make like a nice little tesseract, a nice little connection between a slow state and a fast state? Part of the reason I did this is because there are going to be people who need a better communication. They need theta and gamma, a slower state and a faster state. They need better communication so that they can shift between them. There are some people that need them to be communicating so that they can be operating together. Because here's the fun thing about your brain frequencies, is it's not like you make one at a time. You're making theta, beta, alpha, gamma all over your brain, all the frequencies all the time in different places. But whatever ends up on the same wavelength has an easier time communicating. And that's essentially how we build networks. Who all's on alpha right now? who all's hanging out in gamma, what areas are making theta. So the areas that end up on the same wavelength, it's much easier for them to communicate and form a network. We want that synchrony and communication, and we also want the capacity for independence. So some of these protocols, you'll see that there's a little more asynchronous independence, and some of them were asking for more synchronous communication. So I've mainly been doing that by kind of physical network. And now I'm doing it with a cross-frequency coupling. So what's happening in here is that first little stage is a little theta, try to get that bottom of the brain recruited, right? And then the LEDs that are around the peripheral bottom of the brain, those are all hanging out, those are all blinking in theta. And the ones at the top of the brain are blinking in gamma. But they're doing them in the same LED at the same time. So what that means is each location, so let me re-clarify. The ones at the bottom of the brain are theta and gamma cross frequency together. The ones at the top are gamma only. Because what we want to do is see at the bottom, I said, let's do some theta. And then I said, keep that theta. Now the ones at the bottom, let's add gamma on top of it, but then let's also add gamma at the top of the brain. The reason I put it together like this is because I'm trying to recruit those sensory motor networks, motor movement, motor balance, the stuff that we know that happens at the cerebellum. And that we, like, if we even think about, like, there's so much volitional inhibition of movement that's happening from the anterior cingulate. Basal ganglia, cerebellum, anterior cingulate is a classic, motor connection. And so I'm trying to kind of pull what we know the body does to try to communicate with the brain to balance itself and move. I'm recruiting that. And then I'm saying, how are we making those decisions, right? And so I'm pairing things together that are often impacted potentially by whiplash, brain injury, or illness potentially from the body. And then I'm thinking about, okay, I've asked the brain to pair up some stuff in a complex way. And then I'm like, all right, all the way back to the basics. We know alpha helps with integrating fast and slow, right? We know it helps with the brain essentially being able to kind of balance between engaged and relaxed, right? So we end up with a nice little alpha stabilizer. Now, I told you guys a lot of things in a short amount of time. Fortunately, they're recording this. Part of the reason I gave you that level of detail is because I wanted you guys to see what was possible. Like, all I've done is taken the features they have, and I've done little independent stages, and then I batched them together. You guys can design your own little stages, and then you can recruit them together into a batch. So they just run one after another, right? Like, the idea behind, can I ask the brain to do a couple things in a row, right? It's, I think, a little bit new, not the batch concept, because like I think the batching has been there since like the original version, right? But the idea of like, how do we think it through and design stuff that really kind of mimics or informs or models what the brain does naturally. Now, the last thing I'm going to say before I toss the potato over to Sanjay, I had said this was an excellent segue to hand it off to him. One of the really fun things about thinking through meditation neuroscience is that when you think about what everyone's trying to do, maybe with meditation, I'm going to very kind of almost humorously divide that into just two camps. People are trying to take meditation and they're trying to use it to either expand outward or corral in. So you're either a person who's like, I really would like to expand and connect to the world better than I am, or you're a person who's like, I am all over the place. I am just a raw nerve. I really want to be able to like manage that better and sort of protect myself and focus and like have better mediation between myself and the external environment. It's too much. So people can use meditation to both connect and to kind of modulate, And so theta is about that kind of connection, that sort of internal grounding, and gamma, especially high gamma, fast frequency. Fast gamma is about sort of that external exploration and connection. And so the idea here is there are going to be some people who really would love to they'd love to put a few toes in the water, but they may not they may not have the experience or capacity if they go really high frequency. They may not always have the experience to possibly then sort of recalibrate or recorral, right? To rebalance. So if you take some people and you give them a lot of fast frequency, and then you leave them in high end fast frequency, it may take some time and experience for them to sort of be able to reintegrate and recalibrate and feel more, reconnected to their bodies and grounded. So for people who are like, I want to do that, but I don't quite have, this is a nice little adjunctive or intro protocol where we're like, yes, you get to have 1 foot in high gamma and 1 foot in theta. We've got you grounded in your body, but you also can experience connection. And just in case it was still a little too much, we're going to slap some alpha on the end. And the fun thing is, you can stop it before you get to the alpha that kind of integrates it back together. You can just run it through the first 12 minutes and just hang out in that theta gamma, experience and see how that feels, right? So this is also my nod towards, there are a lot of really fun high-end exploratory, like frequency exploratory things that are possible. Like, what is the frequency range this actually goes up to? It's like in the, what is the actual top end? I forget the actual top end.
9,999.
9,999. You'll notice none of the stuff I've designed goes like outside of 100, right? Not because the potential isn't there. The potential is incredible, but just because these are introductory, right? And we're trying to kind of stay in some ranges that I think are less adventurous right at the beginning. Okay, now time for adventure. Sanjay, I'm gonna stop sharing and I'll go take a peek at the chat and make some notes while Sanjay is taking it over.
Thank you, Penijean. I collected a few of the questions for you, so I'm going to dump them in the chat again. So that would be easy for you to answer them. Sanjay, please take it away.
Okay, can I share?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll come back to that in a second. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk a bit about the meditation protocol that is already set in the Neuro Pro 2 and maybe a couple other things. So we know that regular meditation affects brain structures. It affects connectivity in the brain, increases cortical thickness, boosts some areas, quiets other areas, and is connected with attention and emotional regulation and cognitive functioning and a wide variety of functions in the brain. And we also know that meditation practice influences the neural dynamics of the brain, affecting the brainwave patterns. So I'm just going to introduce the idea behind the meditation protocol here. So one of the things we can see is that when you flash light in the brain waves are modified. And when you listen to music at a certain beat, the brain waves are modified. So what we are doing here is we're flashing infrared light at 8-10 nanometers into the brain. And what would that do? So it has physiological effects actually that need to be studied, but there are also clear EEG entrainment effects. So this is a paper by some people at Vielight who showed that when you flash the brain at 40 hertz pulses with infrared light, like as in the neuro gamma, then you get an increase in certain EEG frequencies corresponding to that pulsing. So increase in the alpha range, the beta range, and the gamma range. And in fact, a decrease in the lower frequencies. So very simplistic way of thinking about it is, what if we could capture the EEG signature of certain meditation, use brainwave entrainment to take the brain towards that signature? Maybe we can do something like that. And there's several issues with this simplistic view, which is that different meditations and different meditators have different signatures in the brain. EEG signatures is not one-to-one correspondence that we can find yet with states. But there's some general trends that we employ quite usefully, and they seem to work. So we're going to look at the trends. Penijean already introduced some of the basic bands, and I'm not going to go through them, the delta, theta, low beta, beta, and gamma bands, but I'm going to talk about general aspects of those bands. So in general, as power increases in certain bands, you get certain subjective effects. So when you have a little more power in the lower bands, like the delta, theta, and alpha in 1 to 12, the focus is more internalized. And Penijean also talked about that. The energy is lower, the body awareness is higher, you have a relaxed state, and you have certain emotions associated with that. When you go towards increasing relative power in the low beta and beta range, then your focus starts to get more balance between the internal and the external world. Your energy level rises, the body awareness decreases but is there. You get more alert, and your emotions are more neutral and present. This is just a approximate way of understanding how the power in different frequencies shows up in relationship to our states. As you increase the stimulation in terms of frequency, or if you have higher frequency power happening in the brain, then you typically have higher energy, body awareness drops, you get a little more dissociated, your focus is more externalized, and your internal state is more activated. You could feel more joyful, open, or even agitated or overexcited. So it's sort of an arousal trend as we go up in frequencies. So this is what I was saying, that as you increase the frequency of stimulation, say with something like the Neuro Duo, your energy level will tend to go up, body awareness will go down, arousal will go up, and focus will go up to a certain degree, and then it may break apart. So I got interested in higher gamma states for several reasons. And that's what I'm going to be talking about here. And there's lots of different ways to connect the Neuro Duo to meditation, but I'm going to talk about particularly the effects of gamma, which have not been studied a lot. So I was one of the early people to start studying the effects of gamma stimulation on the brain relative to meditation. And the reason I thought about that is because there's already literature in the field about gamma increases for long-term meditators. So this is a paper by Lutz et al. And Richie Davidson and Theo Ricard, etc. They measured the ratio of gamma activity to lower level activity, to alpha and theta activity, and showed that it's more for a long-term meditator, it's already higher in the midline. And then as they meditate, gamma increases all over the scalp. So that gives us a clue about higher meditation states. And these are very long-term meditators. In general, I would say that it's an interesting way to think about this, which is that you can think of frequency as an index to states of awareness or the experience of yourself. So as you are dropping into more of a low frequency state, let's say theta, delta, and you have increasing relative power in those bands, you're dropping more into the body level, the instinct level, the unconscious, the pre-personal, and the pre-rational levels of the mind. So typically, we do something like alpha theta training to go back to old memories and support reconsolidation of trauma and old memories. We'll use this theta training. And theta, can go into a hypnagogic state, be in a dreamy state, and access your imagination. And normally when we're functioning like right now, I'm talking to you, there's relatively more power in the middle beta ranges, because this is associated with our usual mode of functioning in society, where our focus is a little more externalized, it's more intellectual thinking, and has to do with how we normally operate with a certain level of identity. Now, if we start to increase the relative power in the higher frequencies, then there is some possibility of accessing more of dissociation from the body, but also the superconscious, the transpersonal, the spiritual, and the post-rational realms. So that was just a way I've understood this by studying some of the frequency effects over time. And so we'll talk about how we might utilize this idea. So here's another paper on that talks about increased gamma brainwave amplitude and power compared to control in different meditation traditions. And we actually know that the brain produces high frequencies in the range of 40 to 200 hertz during normal functioning. You just can't measure them because the skull, this thick bone here, it acts like a low pass filter. It stops the high frequencies from being measured and easily. When you put an electrode on the skull, it's hard to measure the high frequencies. They get blocked. But that doesn't mean the brain isn't producing them. And so you can measure them, for example, if you're doing some surgery and you put some electrodes right on the cortex. Also, for example, if you take a psychedelic like DMT, a psychedelic compound like DMT, and you can show that, there's studies that show that ingestion of DMT is associated with higher gamma power and higher synchrony in the cortex. So I'm just making a case for why gamma is interesting. Yeah. And it turns out that the devices like the Neuro Pro 2 is ideal for stimulating the brain at high frequencies. Now, I've tried to stimulate the brain at high frequencies with microcurrent, for example, and it just gets, it doesn't do well. It just goes through the skull and spreads all over. The frequency characteristics are altered. We found that using light at high frequencies produces very clear effects in the system, better than current and sometimes even magnetism. So the basic idea behind doing a simple meditation protocol is to do coherent in-phase high frequency, and actually you'll see low frequency stimulation. Now it's coherent. We're going to stimulate all these 12 electrodes to start with in phase, in synchrony. The idea is to tell the brain to go into a simpler state, simpler frequency state, like 7 hertz, 10 hertz, 40 hertz, 120 hertz. And normally when the brain's functioning, different parts of the brain are doing different things, and they are functioning at different frequencies. And also they're not necessarily all synchronized. There's a combination of synchronization across the brain, as well as asynchronous activity, which is happening locally, which is very important for cognitive processing. In a meditation state, we want to simplify it. We're not trying to think of profound things in most of these, the kind of meditation states I'm talking about. We're actually simplifying our experience and starting to see and sense into what are more fundamental components of our experience. We're talking about states of emptiness, openness, unity, expansion, etc., which have less thinking content. We're going outside the usual thinking mind. And so the synchrony across these stimulation lights is part of that process. It's helpful for that. Okay, so here we are. We're playing around with a previous version, an experimental version of this in a Science of Consciousness conference in Tucson with a meditation teacher, Chuladasa. It's me and Lou and Reza from Vielight. And we found that when we started to stimulate the brain synchronously at different combinations of low and high frequencies, people were reporting, especially long-term meditators who could sort of get into it right away, get into the groove of it, the stimulation right away. It's reported expansion, lightness, perceptual clarity, peace, joy, energy, reduction in thinking, etc. Things that you want from a deep meditation kind of practice. And part of the reason we initially used and are using more experienced meditators is because the device is like giving a certain, let's say, a certain stimulus is giving a suggestion, an active suggestion to the brain. And then if you can sort of are used to catching on to that kind of suggestion, you can slide right into it, even in the first session that you do. There's less learning involved. You say, oh yeah, that feels familiar. I can go there. And your whole system starts to slide into that. So the reason I use both the low and high frequencies is to produce a balanced state. So just like Penijean was talking about earlier. So even for example, this is from Buddhist practice. This is one way of thinking about so-called mindfulness, a popular word these days, is that in a mindful state, you have a balance between opposing factors. So when you start to meditate, a certain level of tranquility and calmness arises in the system. But it has to be balanced by energy. Otherwise, you get what is called sinking mind. You start falling asleep, you get dull, you're not really present. Also, as you meditate, you naturally learn to feel and see without getting involved in the feeling and the seeing and the thinking. You get what is called equanimity. You decenter and you're just coming to an acceptance with whatever you are experiencing. And but you can also get experiences of joy, bliss, and rapture. And if you get too caught up in joy, bliss, and rapture and not have enough equanimity, then you lose your balance. So equanimity is more like a down regulating state, and joy and bliss is higher energy state, and you're balancing the two. And that helps you to maintain this beautiful state of having a pleasant experience and yet being very peaceful and equanimous all at the same time. Similarly, you develop concentration, and concentration is one pointed focus, and then you may investigate the nature of your experience in meditation, which actually disturbs your focus somewhat. So again, you're balancing these two factors. So that's the idea between balancing low and high frequency stimulation. So in general, I'm almost done here. With high frequency stimulation, with 40 hertz and above, we notice increased self-observation, equanimity. At even higher frequencies, when you go to 80 and higher, you get more positive emotions, feelings of expansion, and a release of the usual limited sense of self or I. And but you can also get agitation, dissociation, discomfort, or sleep issues. And once again, we balance that with the lower frequency stimulation. So the meditation protocol currently that we have in here goes through a sequence. It basically starts at 1 hertz, goes to 5, 7, 10, 14, 40, 120, and 432. So you can see it's just increasing, stepping up from low to high. Starts in the delta range, goes to the theta range, the alpha range, the low beta range. We skip the beta. We're not so focused on thinking here. And your attention will be more internalized and then it will start to actually get more externalized, but in an expanded way. And we could go to higher frequencies, but we decided to stop. I decided to stop at 432 in this particular example, just because not your system has to be primed to actually adjust itself to the high frequency states. So I'm a meditation teacher and I have students, we are playing around with 4,000 hertz right now, for example. So we can do 900 hertz, 1,000 hertz, 2,000, 4,000 hertz, and start to report and start to see what results we're getting from what states we're getting into. We've done a pilot study with meditation and this kind of protocol with 20 long-term meditators with 3 sessions, a baseline session, an active session, and a sham stimulation session. It's a single blind crossover study. We did a pre and post EEG for each session and some meditation measures. The primary measure we used was the mystical experience questionnaire. And that's a questionnaire that's also used for psychedelic experience to try to quantitatively, uh, validate and measure mystical experience. So it has 4 subscales: mysticality, transcendence, positive mood, and ineffability or paradoxability. So we found that overall on the mystical experience scale, the active condition of meditation along with active stimulation has an overall statistically higher score, that there was some positive benefit from doing the meditation protocol. So beyond just the anecdotal reports. I'm going to stop here with that. All right. Let's see here.